So today they asked to talk about the project that we have supported by North Central-SARE. So this includes 3 diseases we targeted: white mold, tar spot, and scab of wheat. I gave this talk last week at Wisconsin. They gave me an hour. I got about 30 minutes here. So feel free to interrupt me, though, if there are questions you have about particular diseases, because we can discuss that as well as what we're looking at here. This is a collaborative project, so I worked closely with the University of Wisconsin, Dr. Damon Smith and Aaron Silva, and then we've had 2 graduate students working on this project as well. For some information, if you're interested on diseases of, this would be organic or conventional production, I have a field crop website, applied research. The Crop Protection Network is a good tool. We put out our research book every year. Hopefully I get next week or 2 get ours out. But those are some tools that are available as well. When I think about disease management holistically, we have to look at diversifying our programs, starting first with host resistance, looking at cultural controls, rotation. In our organic systems, we add a lot of rotation and cultural practices that can help with our disease management tactics. Then we look at how are we scouting, are we identifying pests, are we identifying thresholds that may trigger if we need to add a pesticide, fungicide application, whether it's organic or chemical chemistry. And then we can also look at those biologicals. And so this project kind of tried to target some of the biologicals that I had seen success in other crops to see if they had the label, if they were effective in our grain crops. So that's kind of where we started when we looked at this project. If we look at biopesticides, they're naturally occurring substances. They could be microorganisms, they can be plant extracts, they can be things that trigger a plant host response. There's over 800 plus listed in the EPA website if you look at that. And then organically, if you're thinking organic, you need to make sure that they also have that OMRI listing as well. But that's what we were trying to target. We do have a new pocket in Indiana where we're expanding organic ag. So the question comes up, how do we best manage some of these diseases of concern? There is a new research, we have a new extension book out with the Crop Protection Network. But as I talk about biological products in regards to plant pathogens, we're looking at those things called biopesticides. They could be biochemicals or microbials, and then maybe microorganisms. So again, that's the group. I'm not talking about stimulants or fertilizers or the other side of some of these biological products that are coming onto the market. When I think about biopesticides in regards to diseases, there's generally 5 areas that they are acting in preventing a disease. Either first, they're antibiotic, so they're inhibiting that microbial. They may be parasitizing or predation, feeding on the pathogen. So for example, Coniatherium, when I talk about that, it actually feeds on the sclerotia of the Sclerotiarium. They may compete for the leaf surface or the root surface of the pathogen, so the idea is just to outcompete it. Maybe they're inhibiting it through chemicals, they're releasing chemicals that inhibit infection, or they're turning on plant responses, so some kind of induced response in the plant. We do have this new book that's available for field crops looking at biopesticides in regards to diseases. So this is a new tool that's available online. I just want to say we went through and tried to pull all the products that we could find that were labeled for grains. So you can kind of look at that and see what their active ingredient is and what it's acting on. So here I got an example of actinovate. It's a streptomyces, so a bacteria. Its activities, both exclusion, antifungal, and parasitism. And then you can see what kind of diseases it may target in the grain crops. I also highlighted Coniatherium, which is a mycoparasite. It's actually been shown to just parasitize the overwintering structure of Sclerotinia sclerotium. So that's a new tool that's available. We're still working on, we don't have as much efficacy data as we do on the conventional side of our products, but that's what this goal was, to start initiating some of that efficacy data for evaluating these products in the field. When I look at whether pesticides work or not, the first thing you have to understand is what is our target pathogen. Some may work real well against some pathogens, but not others, and they're not curative. So we have to be ahead of the game for some of these diseases to slow them down. If we think about the environment, if I talk about a plant disease, we talk about the environment always and the pathogen host environment. If you think about a biological, if we're inserting a new living organism, that environment's still going to play a role. And if we're applying it at the right time, is the environment conducive for the mycoparasite or pathogen or the biological to help act and reduce disease. Maybe there's some differences in how the cultivars and crops react to them, and then understanding when they need to be in place to try to manage the disease. And then then look at if they're providing enough disease management to be economical. So again, I mentioned the disease triangle. So again, we're looking, What's the host that we're targeting? Each plant has a time frame when it's most susceptible to the disease. Is our pathogen here? So it's important to understand the disease cycle. Is it overwintering in the field? So we know we have a history of this problem. How do we target that problem to minimize it? Or is it a disease that it's not here and we've got to monitor it every year if the spores move in, like southern corn rust, for example? And then also think about that environment. Sometimes the environment's not favorable, so that we may have the host and the pathogen present. They may be here, but we don't have the environment for the disease to occur. Maybe sometimes we have such a favorable environment that everything we did, the disease is still going to overcome that host and cause a problem. So moving into the 3 diseases we looked at, Fusarium head blight. So this is the Fusarium head blight disease cycle. We're talking about, this is wheat scab, so it affects the wheat heads. It's surviving in the debris here. So it's also, corn is also a host. So if we think about our rotation, if we rotate corn before wheat, we may be building up that inoculum. It also can cause mycotoxin issues in corn if it gets into the heads as well. So then those spores are wind splashed or rain splashed onto the head of the wheat. The infection occurs for Fusarium head blight in wheat at that flowering stage. So that's the targeted stage we need to protect if we're worried about scab in that season. And then as the infection occurs, you get that partial bleaching that'll occur, the pink lesions that develop, and that's where that head becomes shriveled. It may, we'll have chalky kernels that may not be good for grain. They also may contain the mycotoxin, the DON, the vomitoxin. So that's where a lot of the Fusarium head blight risk has been looked at, and how do we target it. So there is a good tool, and no matter what cropping system, you can utilize this tool, the Fusarium risk tool, to see, are we heading into the environmental conditions at heading that are going to be conducive for Fusarium head blight? So if I look at this last season, we had very little Fusarium head blight in Indiana. It was clean. We didn't need to do anything that year. We probably could have, those guys that sprayed probably didn't need to spray. But again, this tool is going to predict it. So you pull it up, if we're getting approaching heading, do the conditions look conducive? So here I selected for susceptible variety. You can see New York, Pennsylvania, they had high risk there for Fusarium head blight, but we were pretty clear in Indiana with a susceptible. If we decided we went and planted moderate resistance, it gets the risk goes down even. So this tool will pull those things in to kind of predict, is the disease going to be a problem in season? And so we can utilize that tool and then try to make an informed decision if we need to put something out to protect the head. So that's the background on Fusarium head blight. So when we were looking at organic wheat, we set up trials in both Indiana and Wisconsin. We picked 2 cultivars, one that was a little more susceptible to head blight and one that was more resistant. And then we looked at 5 different treatments. We threw in our classic fungicide treatment that we'd use for head blight, just to give an example of maybe the treatments may provide control, but maybe not as good as what we see with a classical fungicide. And then we also inoculate. So none of our trials are run on an organic farm, because you don't want me inoculating disease on your farm. But so we're just trying to look at pushing the envelope on the disease. How will these products work organically? So we had a copper out there, pace setters 1, which is a fungus, sonata, a bacillus, so a bacteria species, and actinovate, actually the streptomyces. So those are the ones that had a label for wheat, and we looked at those across the different locations. One big theme that you're going to notice here, and it was the theme I had in the last talk I gave over on tar spot, resistance is the way to start, right? And so I'm going to push that's probably the best option, is if we can identify resistance. And that's where I'm going to land with all of these diseases, is if you can identify cultivars that have resistance, we may limit the need for anything else. But again, so this is looking at severity of head blight in the cultivars. So the Harpoon and Kasiowski index and severity. So you can see the severity takes how severe that head was infected. So you can see we have definitely one that has better resistance to wheat scab versus the other. That was in Indiana. If we look across the region again, for Wisconsin, similar data set. So they saw again, the one could keep disease really at bay versus the other. So again, first make that selection for a wheat scab resistant variety. Then if we look at those products, and so I've kind of set them up where my non-treated is the dotted bar with a pattern in it compared to the other products. So again, this is in Indiana for those 3 years. We did see some differences between the products reacting on the different hybrids. So again, Harpoon is the more resistant, Kasiowska a little more susceptible. So you can see if I look at that, I want a different letter. So if I look at, I'm on an angle here, the Kasiowska on the right here, we do see that Sonata and Pacesetter might reduce Fusarium incidence, and then Champion or Prosaro in the other one. So we got a couple products that may minimize the amount of disease in that, but the Prosaro, again, is our fungicide. If we look at Wisconsin, they only saw the Prosaro, so they only had the fungicide work. And this is the one issue we've seen with a lot of these biologicals, is we don't have consistent, good, uniform data on how they manage disease. But this is what we're trying to build, and we need multiple years to really build up the information of what may work. Champion keeps popping up. I would say the copper, which is a protectant, needs to be there, may provide some disease. So if we look at the harvest data, I think is what I got here. So we have Don, so that's important. So again, the resistant variety provided less mycotoxin development as the susceptible in Indiana. We had less Fusarium damaged kernels as well. But then if we look at the yield across that, Champion had a little lower yield, but Pacesetter and Actinovate are similar to our non-treated on yields. Sorry, I did that backwards, FDK. So actually, sorry. Champion is reducing disease compared to the non-treated in that one. I got all these too many slides together. But again, so that's why I say maybe this copper might protect something. If you don't have any other options, maybe we can look at that copper to applied. The one side note with copper is, it's a 7 to 10 day application window. It's probably going to wash off with the rain. So the protectant's not going to be there, but the goal is to protect just that area where we're at flowering with the fungicide. Again, if we look at Don in Wisconsin, again, resistance provided good Don protection. They didn't see any influence of the treatments, but again, similar, actually they saw a little bit less in the susceptible with the FDK, but they could have, if we think about harvesting wheat, they may have blown out some of those damaged kernels if there was more damage in those kernels. Again, in yields, they really saw the difference in the yields, so less disease, the yields were a little similar, but then they had no difference in yields for their treatments for that one. So again, it depends on your location, and that's why, this is 3 years of data for each location, but we probably need 5 or 6 other locations to continue to build this data to see if any of these really pop in protecting the yield for scab. But this is a start to start us down that road of that. So if we look at Fusarium head blight, variety selection is going to be our first thing for organic management, managing our residue, understanding. So if, I don't know here in Illinois, if you had a lot of Don coming off the corn this season, but I've been getting a lot of calls in Indiana. And if you think about if we had that infection in the corn and we go after wheat, we've now got a higher inoculum level in our wheat crop coming in that we may have to watch what happens, go back to that risk map of what happens with the weather on that. So putting in our legumes or oilseed may help because they're non-host to the disease. And then water management for flowering is another way to try to minimize the infection at the head. So we know there's a number of conventional options at FEEX 10.51, but the organic options are still limited, so that's what we're trying to build up on some of that data set. And then also if you run into, when you get out into the season and you get ready to harvest and you notice you have a lot of that scab in there, we can look at increasing our fan speed and opening the shutters to eject those damaged kernels so they're not in that final grain as you harvest. I don't know what my time is, so. One disease, any questions on scab? Yep.
Can the infection run from wheat back into corn?
Yes, so we can rotate, yes. So if we left the wheat stubble and we follow corn, if we have the infection there too. So that's those two rotation doesn't work for this disease. It may work for other diseases, but yeah, so that's one. And I don't know, it may not it doesn't go to soybean, the graminearum, but of course, if we talk about some other diseases, Fusarium like sudden death syndrome in soybeans, actually corn can still host that pathogen. It doesn't cause disease, but it's still, so that's the important thing is when we're thinking of rotation, are we really breaking that disease cycle? Yep.
I don't do organic farming yet, but we usually grow winter wheat, and a lot of times I think it has blight.
That's probably.
And they still take our wheat. So when it comes with organic,
well, it depends on the level of the level. So I'm guessing I think it's 3 parts per million. I've been dealing with corn lately. I know it's corn is 3 parts per million of vomitoxin. Okay. If your level's below that and they're testing for it, you'll be fine. It's when you go above that level and they test and you ring, say you ding at 5, that whole load could get rejected at the buyers and sent back.
What happens with the blight? Does it cause people to get sick?
Well, the vomitoxin will cause it. Yeah, there's a level for human consumption. Animals, hogs, feed, all that has a level that'll cause them to have issues. That's the vomitoxin. They don't eat well. The hogs won't eat the feed or stuff. So that's what, and there's other ones too, but that's the one of concern. And the problem has been over here 100 years. Like I was looking up information, and back in Indiana, we talk about hogs getting sick in the early 1900s, and it was we hadn't even named the problem, but it was coming from the diseased mycotoxins in the corn. So it's making sure we have quality grain, and I know some of the organic, especially if you're going malting or it's going into beer, and they want organic systems, they're going to have a lower level of tolerance. And even we ran into dog food has a lower one. It's like 1.5 or something, and ethanol has a lower one where they don't want it because it's concentrated, and then they'll have a problem down the line. Yep. So tar spot, how many of you seen tar spot? Was it bad for you guys this year in Indiana? No, or Illinois, sorry. We had pockets. My talk on this, why I like to show this slide, is when we're on that leaf at the left, and if we're at ear leaf, it's game over. We shouldn't even try to control it because it's in gained access. And when I have a favorable year, I can go from the left to the right in two weeks. So that's what, if you've seen it. So we also did, understanding tar spot. We know it's overwintering in the residue. It's probably surviving more than 1 year. So even some of our rotations may not provide that. It releases those ascospores, and if you've had a history, it's coming from the bottom up, so you can monitor it to track it and then see where the disease occurs. So again, organically, we were looking at how do we manage our tar spot if we're looking at some of these more OMRI-listed products, will they work? So we started with one hybrid, and then Wisconsin came up with one with a susceptible and a resistant one, so we put that in the treatments in the next year. We applied everything at VT Tassel in Indiana. Wisconsin used their tar spotter app, so that would again be something, a predictive model if you have the weather conditions that are conducive for the disease to predict when to spray. So you can kind of see they actually sprayed twice in these plots for those when they're model triggered, and then once in 23. And so then we looked at those products on their efficacy as well. So when we looked at them, we threw in our standard, I would put as headline amp for controlling tar spot. It does a pretty good job on the chemical side. And then we looked at some other products that were labeled in corn. So Serafel with a bacillus, Actinovate again with streptomyces, Badge our copper. And then we also added an oxidate where we were targeting single use. But if I think about some of these products, oxidate has a 4-hour activity window and then it's gone. But it's designed to kill spores. So if I was going to think about utilizing that, I might throw that down and then add a copper or protectant to give you a little longer term residual. But we were just looking at that, and you'll see we still had some interesting results in Indiana on those. But it's important to understand how they're acting in the canopy. And so if we look at our area under disease progress curve in 21, so our severe year, you can see that generally in Wisconsin, headline amp, our fungicide, was the only one that could reduce disease. In Indiana, we did see some separations and some products that actually showed some activity. So Badge, that copper, looks similar to headline amp, so that might be an option organically. And then Oxidate, Actinovate, and Serafel also seem to significantly reduce disease. So they might provide some protection for this disease. It may not be what we expect with a fungicide, but again, we did see some disease reduction with those in that severe year. And then if we look at the yields, again, headline amp, the only one that reduced disease, provided the best yield protection in Wisconsin. In Indiana, headline amp was our best yielder, but it wasn't different from Actinovate or Oxidate, even though they're not significantly different from the control, but they're trending more. So I mean, this is, as a scientist, I'm gonna say they're not different from the untreated, but I'm also seeing they have a trend, and I think sometimes in our organic stuff, we may have to look at those trends and see, can we get a little bit of protection to get us a little better yield potential out of that when we have high disease pressure. So again, so they're not reducing yields, so that's important to see that they're not inhibiting the yields, but some may provide a little bit of protection there. If we look in 23, so we added this hybrid where we thought we had a little tolerance. In Indiana, we showed no difference between the two hybrids. But then you can see actually a stepwise, and I'm missing some letters in here, but they're probably all A's and B's, and actually non-treated control is probably A. Look at that. But you can see headline amp, and then maybe Badge is providing a little, still again, another year where the Badge, that copper, is providing protectant. If I think about the 23 year, that VTR1 application went out ahead of the disease, because the disease didn't move into like R3, R4. But that's where we got to be ahead of it. In our other research, we've shown that if we go in and we have 2% or more disease, we're not going to slow it down. So we got to be ahead of it again for some of these, knowing it's active. But I know for tar spot, we can scout and find those first lesions in a field. And even at 1%, if I find tar spot at 1%, it's on every plant. And I still think you can protect some of that yield with some of these products. And then if we look at what happened in Wisconsin, they did see a difference between their hybrids on their susceptibility. They had a little less tar spot, and then no difference in treatments. But again, this is what we keep building the data, and the more data we combine, we'll get better yield separations and changes in yield disease control. Looking up at the yields, again, the yields were kind of flat for that year. Again, I would say tar spot wasn't as severe this last year, but you can kind of see where we're looking in both of the trials there. So from looking at tar spot, again, I'm going to see if you can identify some resistant hybrids. And I know that Albert Lee may have that information for some of those hybrids that we used. And then we know fungicides can increase our protection, but they're going to have to be ahead of that. And some of our other work has shown if our fungicides are behind the game, they're not going to catch up for tar spot. Any questions of that? I know I'm going through fast. They gave me 30 minutes. We're good? Okay. Well, white mold I can talk more of. This is my recommendation for all tar spot. Just understand where it is. I didn't show the map today, but we have this map that's available that'll show when it's active in season. Right now, if you went and looked at it, if you search tar spot map, it's going to come up. Mine on Indiana website will have gold. The others may have red. But if I turn on a county, what I'm saying is not spray. I'm saying get out and look. We found some lesions. It's time to think about what we got to do if you can find it on your farm. Then there's the Tar Spotter app, and there's also a Field Profit app that's doing a projection. That you can put in your individual fields and see is the risk there. Have I had the right conditions for the disease to take off? And then you could make a decision. We have an efficacy table available for the conventional products, and hopefully down the line we'll have one down for all some of these biologicals coming out as well. So that's just something to think about for tar spot, some of the tools that we have available. And then switching gears one more time, so in soybeans, we wanted to look at white mold, and I think this is where we've seen a little more interesting work on some of the work we did. So this is what white mold looked like. How many of you had white mold in your farms? A few? This was the worst year I'd seen in Indiana since I moved there. And I could drive down fields in north central Indiana, and they were just white mold. It was hitting every plant there. And if you get in the canopy, you can see that white fluffy mycelium. So a little bit of what we're thinking about when I think about managing white mold and how I would layer in different tools. We know it survives in the soil sclerotia. Those sclerotia can live up to 10 years. So if you know you have a white mold field and you're an organic farm, don't move that soil to a field you don't have it, or you're going to have that problem in that next field. So that's something to think about, is cleaning our equipment and not moving soil around. This pathogen's evolved pretty good with the soybean host. When those canopies are beginning to close and that microenvironment's conducive, it's going to start producing those little mushroom structures. They're going to release the ascospores. It's the ascospores in the flower that gain access to the necrotic flower where white mold's gaining access. When I worked in peanuts and white mold, the sclerotia can directly penetrate and get in with our mycelium. They didn't have to release their spores to cause the disease. So this one though, but this one's getting in through the flowers, so that's the access point on the plant. And then they develop in the plant and they produce the sclerotia. So if we think about what we're trying to do when we manage it, our cultural agronomic practices, identifying resistance, rotation, row spacing, population, we're acting on the host and the environment there. Can we change the microenvironment there that's less conducive for tar spot? That's where those are acting. In this trial, we looked at roller crimped rye, and so we're inserting it here. And the idea with the roller crimping is we're laying it over the top of those sclerotia. And some work out of New York had shown that it's inhibiting the development of the mushrooms, so the mushrooms aren't developing correctly. And then it may also provide the physical barrier to capture those spores being released. So that's what we're thinking about for roller crimped rye. And then if you think of our fungicides or biologicals, they're going in here and protecting that canopy around the flower. So that's their target. Where's the best target and when did that need to occur? And then finally I added, and I don't have data on Coniotherium here today, but we also look at Coniotherium contans. It's a product that's available. It feeds on the sclerotia. So if you think about how do we manage this in general, we want to reduce, if you think about your weed seed bank, we want to reduce our sclerotia bank in that soil year to year. And the idea of putting a mycoparasite in there was that it would attack and feed on the sclerotia. That takes time. So if you applied it in the spring, there might not be enough reduction to see an effect on disease. But over time, if we try to inhibit the disease being shed back to the soil every year through all these different tools, maybe we can reduce the risk in the field. So that's where I think about how I would manage if I had a field with white mold problem. And so in these trials, we did a tillage treatment. So we had rye, and then we roller crimped part of it, and we tilled the other part. We had 2 cultivars. So Wisconsin has a moderately resistant cultivar, MN 1410 and then 52. And then we had our susceptible ones. And then we looked at foliar fungicides applied. We went at R2, so just at almost full flowering in Indiana, and R3 in Wisconsin. They have a sporecaster app. So there is a sporecaster app as well that's going to pull in that weather data. When are you at flowering? Have you had row closure? Are the conditions conducive for this disease to take off? So there's also a way to predict that, and then the different products. So again, similar products, Actinovate, Botry Stop, Double Nickel, and Serafel were our OMRI products. And then I picked and used Approach in Indiana, and he used Endura in Wisconsin. But again, 2 products that are white mold products that we would use conventionally. And so that's an example of what our plots look like, that split plot where we did the roller crimped rye. So 2 tillage treatments, 2 cultivars randomized across that, and then fungicides. In Indiana, we actually inoculated, so we put down sclerotia before we roller crimped the rye. So we actually added more sclerotia to the system, and then we try to assess disease. But of course, one side note is whenever we try to have disease in a field, we don't get disease in that field. So, but there were some interesting things. We did get a little bit of disease. And this was pretty interesting. So Dwight, my susceptible, I did have more disease in my full tillage versus my roller crimped. So we managed to keep disease lower by adding the roller crimping when we planted a susceptible. If we picked a resistant, we didn't have disease. So again, if you can start with picking your right cultivar selection, that'll help. Yep.
This is from one site year?
This is one site year, yes. So what we're trying to lay, they were each differently in each season. That's why I'm trying to show them. Yeah, one site year, that's kind of what we saw. Yields in this year were not different. We had one year where one of the varieties handled the roller crimping better than the other. So sometimes your varieties may interact with the cover crop roller crimping as well, just as a side note. So, but overall, really no disease effect. Again, I'm still on that white mold scale. It's low. We're at a low level. We didn't hardly have any. And then again, if we looked at the products, they didn't separate. But that's a par for the course and why we got to do multiple years of work to try to really push it. But these are the products that we were looking at. And then no changes in yield. So that's my unfortunate part of my story is we don't have good disease data yet. Wisconsin, and I think this is where we get back to the varieties again, they did have severe disease. And you can see, so the disease is on the left. Dwight, had more disease versus the Minnesota, which is less disease, the blue bars, and then the yields are the gold bars. So you can see, again, reduced disease, increased yield. So again, hybrid selection, variety selection is the first thing we need to target in organic production if you're worried about this disease or any other disease. I think that's my main point through all of these. They did see a reduction in disease actually in this time, so it flip-flops. In Indiana, it flip-flops. So that's the thing is we got to merge these together and have one more year data to add on that. But again, our disease index is low. And again, in yields, we're flat in Indiana for all of them. I wish I had better data to show. But again, here in Wisconsin in 23, again, they showed the resistance could reduce disease. And then they actually saw then they had more disease, so they did see some disease treatment effects. So that Endura, again, our standard conventional product, did significantly reduce disease, but then Double Nickel and Serafel are in there. And so I think that's where we got to target some of these that fall that are not quite what we want to see, but maybe they'll add a little bit to the system. And then they did see a little increase in yield by that variety that was resistant, and then actually their tilled had higher yield. So again, we got to figure out how the best tillage practices would work in each soybean system. And so we know some of the things we think about white mold, reducing residue from previous years. We do see that roller crimp rye may impact spore release. Using moderate resistance is probably the way to target. And then we know from other work that targeting flowering can increase our protection when white mold is going to be a problem. And then moving forward, we are going to start expanding, looking at Coniatherium a little bit more. And my question is, when do we need to apply it? So probably we need to put it right after the crops come out in the fall, so we have a longer time frame for it to work before acting on the sclerotia. But we're going to start looking at some more of that targeted research moving forward. And so there's all these apps to help predict disease. So the Scab Smart website, the Sporecaster app and Tar Spotter app are there to help predict when the disease is going to be a problem. And then we did have this new publication at the Crop Protection Network on biopesticides for crop disease management. It's what we're calling a web book. So you can't download it, but it's got all sorts of sections on different biologicals. And I think that's all I have. Everybody got their pictures? If you need these things, let me know, I can share this deck. So again, final thoughts, host resistance, understand the cycle, where are we trying to place these control measures? If you try something new, let's leave some non-treated strips to see if it really works. And then thinking about conventional stuff, I just want to push, we got to rotate our modes of action. And that's where these biologicals may come into play, is they're acting completely different than some of our chemistries that we use currently. And then I'm going to skip that one. So there's my information, and then there's the Crop Protection Network, another resource with all that information. Any other questions? Answer? Yep.
You mentioned it on one slide.
Yep, my information. Yep, there it is.